Welcome to Lunch with Tech Leaders, where we have engaging conversations about software development and cloud engineering with industry leaders and subject matter experts. These episodes are created by the Great Lakes Tech Leaders, an online community of technology practitioners. Please come join the conversation by visiting gltl.rbn.ai. Again, that's gltl.rbn.ai. Now strap in, because we're deploying to production in 3, 2, 1.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lunch with Tech Leaders, episode 22. Today, we're going to be talking about QA and software QA. But first, I want to introduce my co-hosts, my usual partner in crime, Tom Kowalski. Say hi, Tom.
Howdy. Hello. Hello, everyone. Excited to talk about some QA today.
Yeah. And rounding our panel up, we've got Zachary White.
What's up, guys? How's it going? Thanks for
Hey,
having me.
Glad to have you, Zach. And moving on to Jim Branchow.
Hey, how's it going? Did QA for a few years, and now I'm a release engineer, which is pretty tightly coupled with QA. So glad to be here.
Yeah, I think we're going to talk a lot about that today, about the path of the QA engineer. So yeah, good stuff. And last but not least, we've got Bilal Hussein.
Hello. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, welcome, guys. So yeah, I'd like to start the show off with a little bit of contextual history about the topic. It's part of I get a lot of enjoyment out of like researching some of these things that you think about, that we do this stuff every day in our life, but we never really take the time to understand how it came to be. So with QA, the most interesting part of QA, as I found, is like it dates back to the age when there was guilds, like the woodworking guilds and the blacksmith guilds. So that the standards were in many ways defined by the monarchy, right? To say, and then there was like very strict like controls, like you had to be part of the guild if you wanted to make this certain thing. And that's kind of one of the reasons why there was like not a lot of innovation, right? Because like you weren't like, if you were if Zach came along and said he could make a sword 10 times better than the guild would just shut him down and shoo him away. So yeah, really interesting. So then you get into the Industrial Revolution. And that's kind of where you see some of the origins of modern QA, especially with the manufacturing. You got pioneers like Henry Ford and Frederick Taylor there. And then in the 20s and 30s, QA shifted to using a statistical methods. This is known as the statistical quality control. 50s and 60s, you see another big jump in the evolution of QA, and that's kind of like the World War II, post World War II, you kind of see this like acceleration of like a lot of technology techniques, and that's where TQM emerged. That stands for total quality management, and that's where organizations started like applying systemic and holistic approach to quality like across the org. So everyone was responsible for QA, right? And the whole like the Toyota mantra of continuous improvement and things like that. So moving on to software QA, pretty closely tied to software development, and pretty much out of the gate there was a need for testing software as the programs became more and more complex. So the earliest approaches to SQA was the inspection method, which was developed in the 50s by Dr. Wolfgang Scheibach. In the 60s and 70s, the focus of SQA shifted to testing with the development of various testing methodologies and tools. These included concepts like unit testing, integration testing, system testing, among others. Then in the 80s and 90s, SQA continued to evolve with the emergence of new technologies and software development methodologies. These included the use of object-oriented programming, agile development, and the rise of open source software. Another fun fact, who coined the term bug and where did it come from? Something I always wondered about, like, why do we call them bugs? And there's a little bit of controversy with this because a lot of people will say that Thomas Edison coined the term bug. It was in one of his letters because he would develop these mechanical systems, and so I'm not really sure what the truth is, but I think the truth is that the term bug, as it relates to software, was coined by a woman named Grace Hopper. who was a pioneering computer scientist in the 40s and 50s. And she was working on the Mark II computer at Harvard, and she discovered an actual bug, a moth that was attached to the hardware, to one of the circuits of the computer. And she removed the moth, taped it into her logbook with the following note: first actual case of bug being found. And then this is widely considered the first documented use of the term bug. So if anyone wants to do some additional research, help to sort the controversy of who invented the term bug, feel free to email us at we don't have an email address yet, Hannah. We got to work on that. So anyways, moving on to our discussion today.
Join the Discord and talk about it. We'll have a thread going.
Yeah, I see Kyle's already on the case. So I'll just kick it off here with Zach. Can you describe your role as a SQA engineer and what it means? What are you doing?
What am I doing right now as far as senior QA goes, and I guess what makes it senior QA? I guess that's sort of a broad one because it sort of depends on where you're at too. Like, your title is sort of a reflection of your own skills and like how other people perceive you, right? So, what makes it senior? I don't know, honestly. I'm on a new position right now, so I'm still sort of getting my feet wet at this new company. But I guess for SQA,
just to clarify, I was software QA. I was
yeah,
thinking senior
software QA.
Okay, yeah.
All right, so it's software QA, not QA, not senior QA. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So like what is like describe your day as a QA engineer?
Oh, for sure. It's probably looks a lot like anybody else's engineering day. It's Scrum meetings. It's the same meetings you're going to. But outside of that, it's collaboration with developers and product managers and engineering managers on test coverage and plans and planning for products that aren't even groomed yet. Trying to get insight into the future. That kind of thing. So it's not just sitting around and exploratory testing or writing automation and that kind of thing. It's a lot of the same stuff that developers do, a lot of interpersonal stuff. Yeah. What's it? I guess getting somebody else's insight on it would probably be pretty good.
What does the team? What does the structure look like? Like, what team are you on? Is it a QA team? Like, where's the organization at in like their DevOps journey, or do they? Are they following that, or what does that look like?
So the team structure is a normal Scrum team. So full stack Scrum team where I'm at. We have people that can take care of the back end and the front end. Our stack is it's a Spree backend, so it's a Ruby on Rails, and then just a React front end. So if you're familiar with those, either engineering or testing, then you know what's going on there. But it works out pretty similarly to what we've all seen before, right? So a ticket will come in on your sprint, developers will work on it, it'll land on QA, since having a ticket tested or having automation written for a ticket is part of the definition of done, which is probably something else you could talk about. But yeah, that's where it fits in the lifespan of, like, I guess, a ticket. And then as soon as QA is done with it, whether or not you do like a PM review or something, and then it's done, released, whatever you do at the end.
Okay. Well, are you like specifically focused on QA? Do you guys have more like you say, full stack engineers? Are you guys more T-shaped individuals? Are you working on some things here and there, documentation, dabbling in front end stuff, or are you strictly QA on your team? How does that work?
So in my current position, it's mostly QA and like I said, I'm still getting my feet wet. But in my previous position at my last job, I was the only QA at the company, which sounds impressive, but there were only like 20 people at the company, right? So we're not really hurting for too many QA people. And in that role, I wore more hats, I guess. So I was doing PRs or MRs, I guess, for the developers, since there weren't all that many developers. So if it was a technology I was familiar with, I was getting my hands dirty with that. I did a little bit of application code for a a fast API implementation, which is in Python. So always opportunities to learn things, get your hands dirty. And I think, like Tom mentioned, one of the pipelines, I guess, for QA people, and pardon the pun, is going towards DevOps, right? So it's sort of like an engineering or DevOps pipeline from QA, if that's what people usually focus on, I would guess.
Wanted to shoot a question over to Bilal, just kind of take us through your career path. Like, how does one get even started in QA? What kind of intrigued your interest in QA, and how did you go from, how did you start your career to where you are now?
Sure. So I guess I kind of, let's say generally I stumbled into it. I was doing, I have a support background, so I was in support for a video game and software publisher based out of Michigan. And part of the role was kind of also doing QA, so doing some manual testing around new builds. Customer writes in with a bug. A lot of times we would have to reproduce that before our developers would even look at it. So just really heavy on documentation and just trying to save as much developer time as possible so that when they look at a bug, they can just really pop in and reproduce and fix ideally. So since that kind of had a QA, little bit of QA involved in it, I really started to kind of venture out a bit, and I ended up at a startup called FarmLogs that's I think since been acquired. But I was the first QA hire, and I was the first QA hire by the QA manager who was recently hired. And it kind of had an interesting start there where after a week, he decided that the startup life wasn't the best for him and he quit. And I was the only QA hire there, only QA there with pretty much no formal experience. So I just kind of like started to figure things out, do some research and delve into the world of automation a bit. And then from there, we hired on Travis, who I believe is in this Discord, Travis Walker. So basically he helped. He was definitely had a couple years under his belt and really helped kind of show me the ropes a bit from a more formal perspective. But from there, I ended up, after a couple years of doing automation for FarmLogs, I ended up at DaySmart, and that was kind of where I had my first opportunity to really start building things from the ground up. And we built our frameworks. We built our own automation infrastructure, and pretty much both the frameworks and the infrastructure went through a lot of iterations. But I worked there with both Jim and Zach, and we pretty much owned everything end to end. It was fun gig. Then from there, ended up in my current role in DataSite, which is a lot more, I'd say, specialized in both UI and API automation. So don't do as much work around the automation infrastructure, but I do heavily specialize on working on our own framework that we own, and then integration to our CI/CD pipeline.
Yeah, that's a nice story.
So in your current role, are you like on your own team, or are you working like in a delivery team or engineering team, or how does that work?
I'm on an engineering team who's also part operations team, so I'm kind of in an interesting position. I was actually I'm one of the few QAs who was hired in and reports directly to an engineering manager rather than a QA manager. So
Yeah,
I'm kind of
your title's like software developer and test or something fancy, right?
It's senior QA. I originally that was what was on the posting, but at the end of the day, it's basically a software engineering title where we're kind of all under the same sort of umbrella. So on my LinkedIn it says senior QA engineer, I guess, if that answers your question.
So back to Tom's question, you actually report to an engineering manager, and how what's the topology of the team you work on?
Sure. So we've got 4 engineers, 3 backend, 1 front end, and I'm the sole QA engineer. We own essentially we're a company that's leaned pretty heavily into the microservices architecture, both microservices and micro front ends. And so basically we own the off pieces. We also own the gateway. So with microservices, essentially, you want to have sort of one gateway that everything kind of touches, rather than the front end reaching out to individual microservices. We have kind of a wrapper around all of those microservices that everything goes through, and my team owns that as well. So it's mostly an API and operations team, but we do have some pieces of the front end that we own around, login, and password reset, basically off, I should say.
Um,
I got a question that kind of leans into like team structure and stuff like that. Zach, you mentioned that you're kind of embedded into the software team, and that tests are a part of the card being considered done. My question, and this has been something that I've seen done multiple different ways, but like how do you guys keep the sprint running and people working when like obviously like some feature needs to be, a test needs to be written, but that means the feature needs to be there, right? Like, do you guys offset in any way so that QA is offset by like a couple days or a week or something like that? Or
Yeah, so I think the goal is to try to get your hands on like the smallest testable piece of whatever feature you're working on. So like endpoints, even if they don't return information, you could get your test set up for that, just so you know when a little bit more work's done, you can anticipate like we need to check that we're returning X, Y, and Z, or we include these headers or whatnot. So instead of getting like this entire project is done and now we need to QA it, and that's sort of like these tickets are held hostage until testing is done, is sort of alleviated by like doing as much as you can as the process of the feature or project is happening. So it's small chunks moving fast kind of thing. I understand that probably wouldn't work for everyone, and sometimes it does fall into a situation where you get kind of waterfally, where it's like, okay, well, we need to get it out, so let's just get it out and circle back and write tests for it. But I feel like I've been lucky because we've been able to make it work where it's everybody's sort of on the same page, setting the pace, and we're not like dropping the ball on making sure that we have good tests written for stuff.
To add on to what Zach said, I think a lot of times you kind of have to make, if you're able to keep up with ultimately the code that's coming out during the sprint, that's kind of an ideal state. But in some cases, you might have a lot more features and functionality coming out than you're really able to feasibly automate within a sprint or however it is. So in some cases, you might have to do a little bit of risk assessment and think about where you can really maximize the value out of your time being spent automating things. And then, as Zach's mentioned, you can kind of make tickets or just kind of have a mental note to come back and fill in the gaps at areas where you weren't able to really cover during the sprint or before that release.
A question for Jim, which is, what are some of the common misconceptions about quality assurance, and how do you deal with those misconceptions?
Okay. Yeah, so I think probably like my biggest pet peeve, right, is when somebody asks the question, why didn't QA catch this bug, kind of thing, right? I think that's kind of like a almost toxic mentality, right? Because at the end of the day, the delivery team as a whole is responsible for quality. So that does kind of mean that there's like a kind of a cultural mentality change, right? Those are usually the hardest to deal with in general. But I think things like shift testing left and really educating, as a QA, educating the developers and engineers on the team on, how and why we're testing things kind of can help alleviate that. So just kind of comes back to communication, helping developers.
Yeah, I can say that even from like, you get us reach a certain level of executive and they just don't, it doesn't matter. Like, right, they just want to know how did QA let this happen? And it's just like,
Right.
I don't know how many times I've tried to explain it. Like, well, it's a whole organizational thing. It's not just like one QA guy on a delivery team that's responsible for like talking about being set up for failure. If
Yep.
you're the scapegoat for any bug that makes it to production. So yeah, and That's really interesting. Anything else to add there? Anyone else?
I think that's a pretty common, I would say, culture issue, because at the end of the day, I feel like quality, everybody owns the product really. And at the end of the day, quality shouldn't just be QA's responsibility. It should be kind of a holistic approach where, everybody's as deeply invested into ensuring that you release something that works well and, generates revenue at the end of the day.
So when you guys talk about, it sounds like you guys are in a pretty good situation with your team topology, but it also sounds like the QA of that team falls on your shoulders. Is like, are you guys actually writing the tests, or are you kind of like coaching the developers how to write tests? Like, are the developers writing their unit tests and you're writing integration tests, or is it truly like a joint effort where like all parties are like responsible for who's writing the tests? Is my question. Is it shared, or is it the QA guy still?
Yeah, so I mean, it definitely varies across different teams, but I think what my goal is working on a team is, everybody should at least be able to make some kind of maintenance changes to any of the tests, right? Which comes back to educating the developers on, test cases and, the tools we're using for these test cases. And this kind of also alleviates, the QA squeeze, so that way, the tickets aren't getting blocked or bottlenecked at the end of the day, right? So kind of like what I like to see the QAs as like a subject matter expert, and they probably are the main ones writing the test cases, but we also want to empower anyone on the team to be able to update and help maintain these test cases, right? Because it's just another branch of software development, especially with the test automation, right? So like there's a lot of things to go into it.
Yeah, I would get frustrated if the business makes a decision to push a feature out the door without having test automation in place. Like, it seems like you should be building the tests first, right? Like that's how you increase the speed of your developing, is doing the test driven development. So like, I don't know. My question is, like, at this point in your careers, if you guys came across an organization or were working for an organization that like was totally off, would you even like, it just seems like you wouldn't even bother working there if they were kind of taking having a QA mindset that was so much an anti-pattern.
Yeah, I think that's essentially like trying to hold back the flow of a river by just getting in and holding your arms out. Really, you have to really be at a company that has like a strong culture of quality to work on a team that really will be comfortable with waiting until the test, because sometimes the tests do take a little bit longer than development. Sometimes you might write your test, kind of do your test development first, and then realize that something's off in the way that you wrote the test. So there might be some maintenance or at least some upkeep necessary. And sometimes the team just has to be ready to say, all right, we might shift the release date a few days because we need tests there before we push the button to release to production.
Yeah.
So do any of you follow that methodology, right? The test first or test driven, and what does that mean to you, right? Or your organization? What challenges do you have if you do follow it?
I'll say for me, it comes down to how much documentation is there before I start writing tests. There are some things that we document really well, and we have a really solid understanding of how, what the contract is sort of going into it. There are some things that, comes down from, because we're also sort of an operations team. Sometimes we have just fires to put out, and in those cases, it might be kind of a case where we backfill a test. But in general, I try to write the test as early as possible.
Yeah, kind of to add to that, like in my previous role working at DaySmart, some of the teams I was working on, we were like in our planning and refinement meetings, we were not necessarily like full on writing the test cases and code, but we were going over like what do we want to test, what are the steps. That's kind of like where Cucumber comes into play, because we're just in English writing out the steps for these tests. We're not implementing them yet, but a couple of benefits to that is, again, the developers see what we'll be testing, either automated or manually. So like they kind of have a good idea of how to make that chunk of code more testable for us. Then also it just helps clarify requirements for a ticket, right? Because if we understand like the user journey through these test cases better, that kind of helps alleviate implementing the
Yeah.
wrong thing, right?
So on that note of the dang, I forgot what I was going to say, but it had to do with the tests. Oh, how do you determine what should be manually tested versus automated testing? Is it more of a technical thing you can't overcome? Like or is it more of like we don't have enough time, so let's manually test this, or like what's is there a decision making process for this test should be automated versus this test should be manual?
So I guess like kind of my point of view on it is automate as much as possible, right? But think some things that are hard to automate is like getting that human feel for how the application works, right? So yeah, we can have a computer tell us that steps 1, 2, and 3 work as expected, but if I look at it and I'm actually physically clicking on it, it's like I'm going back and I just don't like the flow. It's really hard to get some test automation to tell me stuff like that. So really, if it's technical steps, automate it, right? If you're going to be doing it over and over again, go for it. But you still want the human eyes to like tell you, does this feel good, right?
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned Cucumber. I've heard of Cucumber. Is there what other tools? What's like the hot tools, hot techniques that are in play right now for QA? Like, is there kind of like a preferred testing framework, or is it just like so many out there that it's kind of just like anything else? It's what's a good fit for your org? That's for anyone if they want it.
Yeah, go ahead, Bilal.
I was gonna say, I mean, as far as like the new hotness, I think Playwright I've been hearing a lot of great things about, and I've done a little bit of experimentation with it. And it seems definitely like, I think a lot of the latest and greatest tools in the world of QA are really geared around the sort of engineer experience or the developer experience. I think historically, I see somebody in chat mentioned, oh, not Selenium. It's kind of like the reason a lot of people feel that way is Selenium really it's a super robust tool, but ultimately it gives you so many tools that if you ultimately don't know how to jump through all the hoops that Selenium sometimes comes with, that you can kind of end up with some spaghetti code or some tests that are really hard to interpret. I think the reason that Playwright and Cypress is another they're starting to become popular, I think, is they really are geared around making it as easy as possible to not only write tests but also interpret test results. So a lot of times, trying to have to debug a Selenium test can be, assuming the framework hasn't really taken the developer experience into account, it can really be kind of a sort of heavy lift mentally.
That is a big thing for me, right? When doing development, working on projects, that developer experience of getting the feedback, getting good feedback, that was one of the most important things to me when looking at different tools.
For sure. Well, not only just getting good feedback, but getting it fast, I think, is important for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
And a lot of that does come down to like your pipeline, your CI/CD pipeline too, right? Is how do these tools implement with your pipeline? Can I attach the test results to that pipeline? Can I email them right to the developer and say, hey, you broke everything? Or, so like, I think that's like another thing to consider as a QA engineer too, right? It's like, you're not just writing tests, you're trying to figure out, where in the process would this fit in the pipeline or just the SDLC in general. And, trying to improve that feedback loop for developers at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Yeah. While they're developing, right? As fast as they're typing, saving.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's like, to me, the modern day QA engineer is like at the same level, like it needs the same level of knowledge as like, you need the knowledge of the application code, you need the knowledge of the pipeline, you need the knowledge of the QA test. So it's almost like there's the amount of sprawl that's required to be an effective QA engineer kind of blows my mind. And that's when we were working together at the last company, I kind of like had an epiphany where it's like, well, these guys are just like automation engineers that are essentially, undervalued automation engineers is the way I looked at it. And I wanted to get a feel. To me, it feels like there's a bit of a shift in the job market where QA is now kind of getting reaching salaries that are comparable to what senior and lead developers are making. Is that what you guys are seeing, or is that something that you guys are still playing catch up on?
I think I agree with that. I mean, in general, I think the last few years has seen kind of across the industry, QA as its own sort of software engineering discipline. And so I think historically, QA, I think in the past was mostly a manual, kind of thing where you had people either writing or reading a script off and kind of going through the steps manually. And then I think more recently, the shift has been towards just automating all the things. And I think with that shift comes kind of a bump in salary to kind of meet the extra responsibility and the new sort of discipline that's forming around that.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a one-to-one comparison. I don't know if I have the same skills as like a senior software developer, so I don't know if I should make the same amount of money as a senior software developer. But it's definitely a lot better than it was, as you guys said, like you're starting to see the value in somebody who's specialized in writing scripts and software to test and knowing that they have value on a team, so you're wanting to like compensate them for that, and they're not just monkeys sitting in a chair slapping their keyboard trying to get your website to screw up anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and like Jim pointed out, it's not just the technical side, but that behavioral side too, right? So it's not just working with the engineers, but just the product in general and the feel of it, right? That user, that perceived value that they're getting. That's also another aspect, right? Just beyond technical that you have to do,
100%. Because like we are at the end of the day like an advocate for the user. We want to prevent bad changes being inflicted on them. So we're trying to see it through our own eyes.
So getting close to time here. One last question I did want to ask, and then we can try to wrap it up. So like talk about the soft skills required for the job. It does sound like there's a lot of communication, a lot of working with other humans. So how important is there a role for QA engineer who is not wants to be an introvert and just like sit in a cave and write tests? Do you need those soft skills to excel in your career?
I personally think so. I mean, at the end of the day, a software QA is a role that involves really being able to effectively communicate with a lot of folks in different areas of the org. Whether it's leadership on your own team or product managers, being able to effectively communicate your thoughts, I think, is a huge. Being able to do that is a huge boon. Now, that's not to say that if you are an introvert, I think that you can still really make it work, because ultimately the really technical skills are still quite important. But I would say the soft skills are definitely up there.
Thanks. Yeah,
Agree with
not
that.
surprising. Soft skills kind of always give you a little bit of a boost, right? No matter what career you're in. But Jim, were you gonna add something there?
I'm just kind of seconding what Bilal said. Totally agree with it.
Yeah. Okay. Tom, did you have any other questions for the guests before we sign off here?
Not necessarily. I guess Jim, we didn't really dive into it, and I'd love to know about the structure organizationally, right? Like, like where are you guys in your DevOps journey, right? And where do you sit organizationally, and how does that look, like the topology and things like that?
Yeah, sure. So I think we're a little bit earlier in our DevOps journey in my current role, right? As a release engineer, I'm kind of a lone wolf, so to speak, but I'm like to say I'm everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I'm like across every delivery team meetings, just because my job right now is just making sure, like, actually deploying the applications to production, and then making sure they're good to go, organizing any kind of dependencies, things like that. But a big part of that is, working with our QA team, to, obviously want to talk to them, make sure everything's good to go before we throw that code to production, right? Right now, QA is starting to get more integrated with our teams, but I think historically, from what I've seen, they've kind of been their own thing. They get tickets, just kind of so they were sort of siloed off, but we're working towards fixing that. That. Did I answer what you're going for? All right.
Yeah,
I'm also starting to implement automation. There's a lot of manual testing right now, but we see the value in automation. We just gotta get there, right?
Is it driven more like, top down or like bottom up? Like, oh, we need to be, more integrated. We need to take ownership, right? End to end these teams, or like where is it coming from, if it is coming from anywhere?
That's is a complicated question, or can be complicated, right? Some things are driven from top down, but they listen to what we say fairly decently. But it's definitely a two-way conversation right now. So.
All right, I think I'm going to give the last question to our one of our audience members, Lance. If you want to unmic and ask that great question, let's make this our last question for the panel.
Sure. Do you guys use feature flags much in production and test in QA that way? I know like the bigger like Facebook and stuff like that have some very crazy systems around that, but just curious what your experience is with that.
I think that's one of the things we did pretty well at DaySmart, right? Is utilization of LaunchDarkly. So if we wanted something in production, we could push it out there, feature flag it so that we could screw around with it, test it. Nobody else would be affected by it, right? Because nobody else can see it. I think that's a really smart way to do things, especially if you can't like having production-like environments. I learned is very expensive, so being able to test in production is very valuable. In the current position I'm in, we don't really utilize feature flags all that much, but it's probably something to look into, like especially if the question was leading to you need to do some testing in production. Yeah.
I know if it was up to Tom, he'd be releasing to production with the feature flag on day one, just to get it out there. You want to get that. You want to get
commit.
That repeatable commit with behind the feature flag, so that there should be no surprises when you're actually going to prod. Didn't mean to interrupt whoever was wanted to chime in there.
Yeah, I was basically going to ultimately say that it comes down to being able to take as much risk away from the customer impact as possible, and I think feature flags are a great way to do that. We do at my company, we do release things to production quite frequently behind feature flags, and we'll test in production because ultimately for us, kind of going back to what Zach said about test environments being expensive, for us, we have, one test environment for dev and stage, and then we have 3 environments in production for each region where our customers are. So for us, we can sometimes see different behavior, in dev and stage versus in production because kind of the scale is so different. And something else we kind of do to really go hand in hand with releasing features behind feature flags is we started recently putting tests behind feature flags. With LaunchDarkly, they have their own SDK that you can implement in most test frameworks, and ultimately we'll have a feature flag for both the feature as well as the test. So in the event something goes awry, we don't have to merge test code in order to disable some new interaction that we've put in place.
So we can do a whole episode on feature flags. Which I'd like to talk about. What were you saying, Jim?
I was going to say, the kind of second what Bilal said, one of the things that I really value is just being able to, at the click of a button, revert a change. God forbid that everything gets past all our QA checks and tests and things like that, and then we go live, and then it goes horribly wrong. Click of a button, and we're back reverted. We don't have to deploy in any new code or anything like that. It's just, really, really, really low time to recovery. Is that what it's called?
Yeah. RPO, another topic there.
Yep.
So, want to thank our guests, Zach, Bilal, Jim, Tom. Always great conversation today, guys. Really appreciate it. I hope we can continue this series on QA and have you guys back maybe sometime in the new year and talk more about some specific QA topics. But great stuff. Really appreciate everyone coming today and participating. And I hope everyone has a great holidays. And we'll see you in the new year.
You too.
Yeah.
Thanks for having
All
me.
right, thank
Thanks,
you.
guys.
Appreciate it.